All right. The article this week is by Scott Jasek, a familiar name from Inside Higher Ed, and it is Do Top Colleges Favor Applicants Who Are Extremely Wealthy? Well, this article is a response to an article that was written in The Atlantic by a young lady called Caitlin Flanagan. And that article was entitled, quote, Private schools have become truly obscene. Elite schools breed entitlement, extend inequality, and then pretend to be engines of social change. So as you can imagine, this Atlantic article is sort of designed to throw like a intellectual Molotov cocktail here to generate a conversation, which it did. So I'm just going to give a brief summary, Mark, and then we can go straight into this discussion because there's a lot to talk about here.
Absolutely.
So what this article basically, it started with the statement that, quote, these schools surround kids, these schools being private schools, who have every possible advantage with a literal embarrassment of riches. And then the graduates hover up the spots in the best colleges. And it gives these statistics that less than 2% of the nation's students attend independent schools. But in schools like Yale, they represent 24% of the incoming freshman class. At Princeton, they're 25% of the incoming freshman class. And at Brown and Dartmouth, they're 29%. And in fact, in the certain high flyer, the elite elites, in the past 5 years, Dalton in New York has sent 1/3 of its class to the Ivy League. Harvard Westlake in LA has sent almost 9 kids a year, 45 kids to Harvard in just the last 5 years alone. And Noble and Greenough in Massachusetts sent 50 kids. And they said it even is pronounced when you compare the elite publics with the elite privates. They compared Stuyvesant High School, which is probably the toughest grade test in school in the country, with Lawrenceville, a well-known feeder to Princeton, and found that kids from Lawrenceville had a 7 times greater chance of getting into Princeton than Stuyvesant High School. So this generated a lot of back and forth discussion in the rest of the article, so I'm going to stop here, Mark, and ask where you want to take this.
Boy, I am so conflicted on this article, Dave. So I'm going to come down on 2 different sides of it. It'll seem like I'm almost completely opposite views. But I think if people listen carefully, it will make a lot of sense. First of all, I need to shout out James Mason. He's one of our most dedicated listeners. Right from the start, he's been a huge supporter of our podcast. He's in Mississippi. And he sent me this Atlantic article to read at the time, which was become such an explosive article. And so I just want to give a shout out to James. But I want to say something, first of all, in defense of the schools, where I think this article gets it wrong and where I think it's an overreach. So, and I can't remember which book this was. There's a college admissions book that talks about what I'm going to say here in a second. And it just really broke it down in some direct and transparent and candid ways, the way college admissions actually works in ways that you won't hear at other places. And so it said, you know, when you look at all these SAT averages and score profiles and everything that you see, you can't really use those to gauge whether or not you're a competitive applicant at these schools. And the reason why it said that is because if you really break down the way admissions actually works, there are primarily 5 groups of people that have built-in lobbyists in the admission office. So you think of like lobbyists going to Washington, right? And in like the gun lobby, and they'll hire all these lobbyists, or the pharmaceutical company or the insurance company. They hire these lobbyists, multi-million-dollar salaries, work on K Street to work over the politicians and to try to get people to vote your way. Well, that's kind of how admissions works. And this is not something you're going to hear at an information session, but that's our job in this podcast, is to peel back the curtain, show you how the sausage is made. And if you're one of those members that's got a built-in lobbyist on your behalf, you're going to have so much more success in the admission process. And then it says, everybody else it describes, you're just folks. You're just folks. So are you in a category of a just folks or built-in lobbyists? Now, according to the book, it listed, some of the built-in lobbies. It didn't actually include all of them, but I will mention some of the big ones. So there's the alumni.
Yep.
Okay. You're a child of alumni. Look at Harvard's acceptance rates for alumni compared to regular. Even that, I'll tell you, still have to be really strong as a Harvard alumni. I've seen really strong Harvard alumni not get in, but still the acceptance rate is still significantly higher. Okay. If you're alumni, a lot of times at these schools, you have a special admissions committee, a third committee that has to review before an alumni is denied. And sometimes a special phone call is made and all kinds of, so you get special attention as an alumni. One I definitely want to come back to, Dave, and you and I have talked about a lot. One of the biggest ones that flies on the radar, under the radar. Are you a faculty kid?
Yes.
And I want us to talk about that in a second as it pertains to your school, lab school, where your daughter went, and UChicago. A third one, are you an underrepresented student of color? That's extremely hard demographic for them to get. Typically, that's going to be Native Americans, in some cases Latinos, in some cases African Americans, not always Africans or Afro-Caribbeans, depending on the school, and in some cases certain Asian demographics that are hard for schools to get. Okay. Fourth one, development cases. Can your dad build the $40 million building that they're trying to build? And every time you walk in campus and you see someone's name on a building, rest assured somebody with that name gave a big donation. Okay. And then the biggest one of all, athletes, recruited athletes. Now there's some others like celebrity kids. If you're the parent of a celebrity kid, you have a built-in lobbyist because of the publicity the school will get. So let's just go with those. Now, why do I bring that up? Because one of the things that these schools do, they know that colleges are looking for those people, so they recruit them on the front end. So they're in the student body.
And you're saying these schools being the independent high schools now?
Correct.
So
so it really gives a false sense. So someone will look at a college list from these schools, and they'll be like, "Wow, look at where kids from Harvard or Westlake go," but they don't realize that they recruited the fencer or the person that does the sailing or the water polo. They recruit all those people. They recruit the absolute top students of color, like the 1% of the 1%. Okay, they have plenty of alumni kids there. And I'll just give you a case in point. They happen to use the example of Lawrenceville, a school I know extremely well because only 60 some miles away from where I worked. I know a lot of people work in that office and a lot of people at that school. Okay. And they compared that to Stuyvesant and they used Princeton as an example. Lawrenceville is right around the corner from Princeton. It has lots of Princeton faculty. I can tell you, as somebody who's worked with faculty kids, it is almost as big a hook as anything. It carries way more weight than alumni and student of color, being a faculty kid. I can tell you that. It may not carry as much weight as a development admit or a recruited athlete in a revenue-producing sport. And Dave, why don't you just take a second to talk about your experience at the lab school and University of Chicago and how people can get a skewed view if they see how many kids are getting into UChicago from the lab school.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, with the lab school, about 10 years ago, the Wall Street Journal did an article where it included University of Chicago as one of the elite schools and ranked the lab school as one of the top schools for getting the kids into the elite colleges. Well, the University of Lab School is a feeder school for their faculty. And it really started years ago when Hyde Park in Chicago was considered a undesirable place on the south side of poverty and crime. It's changed. And the University of Chicago really put a lot of resources in developing their own independent high school so it would serve the faculty as a recruiting tool for the faculty. So now, even today, over 1/3 of the kids are actually kids of people who work for the university, usually on a faculty role. And it's part of the contracts of many of these faculty that not only if their kids have a much easier time getting into the lab school, but they get discounted tuition both in the high school and in the college if their child goes on to go to University of Chicago. So when you go to University of Chicago, one of the statistics you find is that out of a class of 125, I think 150, a good 20, 25 kids every year get into the lab school and University of Chicago. And it would give you the impression that, man, if you go to University of Chicago lab school, these kids are really smart and they're getting into the university. And that's not quite true. Yes, the kids are smart and yes, they do very well. But if your parent is a faculty member at the University of Chicago, your chances of getting in are multiple times greater than the general public. And having gone to Princeton and knowing Lawrenceville, I can tell you that Lawrenceville serves the same function as the University of Chicago Laboratory High School. It is a feeder school to Princeton where many of the Princeton faculty actually have their kids. It's a huge hook. It's a huge advantage. It's almost so much to say that many of the kids who go to the University of Chicago High School, who are faculty kids, the University of Chicago almost becomes a safety school for them, which is almost unheard of at a school like University of Chicago to say there's any concept of a safety school. So many of these schools, and I know when we talk about a lot of the elite high schools in the Northeast, even though they don't have a direct university connection, schools like Hotchkiss associated with Yale
Correct.
and the ex Phillips Andover and Exeter are associated with all of the Ivies. They have so much alumni and faculty connections to those particular schools that it turns out to be the biggest hook there is. And I'll give it back to you, Mark, on that one.
Yeah, and so I just want to push, like, it's what my point is, you can't just look at the percentage of kids, like the article did, that comes from from these schools, for the Browns and the Dartmouths and the Yales and the Princetons, and then infer that this is just all strictly benefits that they're accruing just because they go there. Yeah, what happens is the kids that are there are meeting a niche need that colleges have. They have lots of kids with these built-in lobbies. And I'll give you another example. William Fitzsimmons is the dean of Harvard. He's been there for 50 years. I had a conversation with him, Dave, about Nobles, which is listed here. And he was like, wow, we got a lot of great athletes from Nobles this year. And Nobles is known as for sending athletes to Harvard.
And Mark, can you please specify in what sports?
Well, normally they're in niche sports, right? I mean, ice hockey could be one, but it can be, a lot of these Ivy League schools have a lot of niche sports that you don't see at other places. They just do.
The point is, these are not
fencing, water polo, skiing. Yeah, correct. Yeah. So, but also they'll go recruit them too. So I just want to point out there is a lot of skew in just looking at the numbers, because if you just take those 6 built-in lobbyists that I mentioned, alumni, faculty kids, underrepresented students of color, recruited athletes, development admits, and celebrity kids, they have an inordinate number of those people at these schools. And that's why you cannot look at a college list from these schools and think that will be you. And I have people do that all the time because I do independent school placement. They'll be, wow, look at the college list at Milton, at Hotchkiss, at Choate, at Andover, at Exeter, and Deerfield, and all the different boarding schools. And they'll think, oh, wow, that could be me if I go there, not realizing that, for example, Dave, you go to Deerfield, you know whose name's all over Deerfield's buildings?
Which one?
What are the name of those brothers? They were 2 of the richest brothers in the world, and one of them recently died.
Koch brothers.
Yes, the Koch brothers. Their names are all over the buildings.
Yeah.
Okay, if you have someone from the Koch family applying to your school, it's nothing for them to drop $50 million and build the new science center that you want, or the new student union, and people get in. And people might wonder, well, why does that happen with faculty kids? Well, think about it from the school's perspective. We have an amazing faculty member. Do we really want them to pick up and switch and go to our competitor because we didn't admit their kid? Like, it's just not worth us losing a great faculty member, So we'll take their B student and we get to keep the faculty member. So that's one thing I want to point out where I think the article really misses things. I also think that, the other place where I feel the article misses things is it sort of went to some of the extreme wealth within the independent schools and sort of painted a brush that all independent schools are like that. And that's just not true. Like, most people actually pick independent schools because they want their child to have more personal, individual attention. They want high academics, and they want some type of character component built into the education. And it's something that if most people, if they had resources, would do it. And it's not necessarily just this gaudy, garish show of extravagance. That is out there, but that is not the norm. And so I do want to point that out.
And then I want to dovetail on that and say, so if you have a typical incoming freshman class at one of these independent schools, and you've already reserved a lot of those spots for faculty members, for wealthy alumni, and so forth, what happens to the remaining spots? Well, I look at it like a process of making whiskey, where you start with something.
Are you a whiskey maker on me now, man? Are you hiding a skill that I didn't know you had? Now you're a whiskey maker. First you're a landlord, you're a doctor, now you're a whiskey maker.
Yeah, Mark also knows I'm a bit of a cusser and a drinker. So
I didn't know you're into the whiskey making.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, when you start off with, there's a great show on Discovery called Moonshiners. It talks about these guys that go up into the Kentucky foothills and make their own whiskey. And when I was down in North Carolina, I loved the little moonshining whiskey. But anyways, with whiskey, you distill the alcohol so you might start off with only 5% alcohol, but by the time you evaporate all the water, you get down to something that's 90 proof. That's similar to the admissions process that, Mark, you can tell about experiences where these schools get a raft of applicants with incredibly high test scores. And by time they actually distill it down to the small group of kids they admit, they have already rejected valedictorians and high test scores and so forth. So the incoming class of kids is already so incredibly strong that you can make an argument that many of those kids that would have gotten in would have done fine wherever they went, because they are just they're skimming off the very top of the academic elite, even when you adjust for all the kids who are alumni and athletes and so forth.
Yeah, now here's the other side of it. I said you're going to be conflicted in my view. So that's the side where I feel that the article is a complete embellishment, almost a caricature, and it really is an example of statistics being used and abused and misused. Now here's the other side. There are lots and lots and lots of advantages that come with wealth in this college admission process. And because what happens at these private schools, they hire some of the top people from college admissions, they come in and explain how things really work. Case in point, Derek Furta, after spending 15 years at University of Pennsylvania, now he's flipped over to William Penn Charter. He's a college counselor at one of the leading schools in Pennsylvania. Don't you think he can educate parents and the whole school and the principal on what Penn is looking for? Of course he can. And so one of the things Bruce Pock points out, former dean of admission at Pomona, and I've really appreciated him because even when he was at Pomona, he was there for almost 25 years. He was always pressing the envelope and pushing for access and things like this. So now he's, in a different role, but he's still speaking out on issues that he's always spoken out on. And he points out how independent schools have, you can study the data on this, study NAIS data. They have high grade inflation, a lot of them. Well, that's intentional. Because if you know that these schools are going to be dinging my kids with B pluses, then you go in and you say, you know what, we got to be careful on how we grade. And I've seen independent schools, Dave, where 70% of kids get grades of A- or higher.
And they make that point, yes.
Yeah, and the point, so the point is, it is true that these schools have expertise that they know how to apply to the admission process that advantages kids apart from just the lobbyists. Another example they use is the essay, the way essays are treated, in independent schools, and also and recommendations. A student really, really well. You can write a full 2-page, in-depth, detailed recommendation. That's a huge advantage. I'm in the admission side. I know what I'm getting. They know their kids. They write with transparency. I know what I'm getting from here. Over here, I don't know what I'm getting. Admissions is about risk and reward. I'm going to go with what I know I'm getting, as long as they don't. As long as writing about the kid doesn't throw them under the bus. But and for essays, yeah, I've shared with this before on this podcast a couple examples. One school in California, I won't name, that has 2 incredibly talented professional writers that write all the letters for the senior class. They send these people off to every imaginable recommendation writing workshop. So they're basically like professional recommendation writers, and they write for everybody. I mentioned another school, in the Gulf Coast area, I'll just leave it at that, where the college counselors see every recommendation before it's submitted. And if they don't like something they see in there from a teacher, they send it back to the teacher and say, clean this up. What you put is going to get this kid denied. So those are advantages that are built into the system with money. But here's where I want to go. I want to go in a different direction with Dave. I want to challenge these schools because where they're not being diverse is socioeconomically. And I've said this before, 39% of the country receives the Pell Grant. It's not uncommon at all at these schools to see 7%, 9%, 11%, 13% getting the Pell Grant. I will commend Princeton. They've gone from 7% 10 years ago up to 19%. That's a huge increase. Now, here's where all of this could change overnight. I've always been so critical of U.S. News and World Report because they never had any component of diversity at all in their rankings. How can you be talking about quality education if it's homogenous? That's ridiculous. So after tremendous pushback and blowback from some people, they've added a little teeny little bit now, what they call social mobility. And basically what they do is they want to see if you're admitting under-resourced kids, are they graduating? Well, all they would have to do is change their formula to say that having more of the population that looks like America is a quality education because you're going out into a real America. And schools that have a higher percentage of Pell Grant recipients get points. It's all formula driven. And then you would see a place like UCLA that's 30% Pell Grant probably be number one in the ratings, or Cal Berkeley. But, these schools can stay with their 13 and their 11 and their 9% Pell Grant recipients and not face any blowback. I'm talking about the colleges. But if the rankings, trust me, rankings drive so much, people don't realize. Board of trustees say, we want to move up in the rankings. What do we have to do? And it governs what the admission office does. So they put pressure on the president puts pressure on the admission office. Next thing you know, you're changing to try to climb the rankings. And that happens at majority of schools. It's not something that's an exception. So all the rankings would have to do is say, if your school is too full of affluent kids, we're going to ding you in the rankings because you don't look like America and you're not preparing people for the real world. And it would change overnight who these schools would admit. That would do more to change all this stuff than anything. But as long as the colleges don't have any incentive to really do that, then they're going to continue to cater to, to more affluent populations. And here's the other thing. When you're wealthy, you can build your kids' extracurriculars from the time you're really young. You can have little Johnny start taking, harp and bassoon lessons when the time he's 4 or 5, and he has 13 years of that, and he can get recruited into the orchestra. You can't do that if you don't have means. So I'm not going to say there's not advantages, but society's always going to have advantages for the affluent. I think it's well, I just want to hear your thoughts because I think I've said all I have to say.
Well, I do want to use this opportunity to actually correct an overstatement we made last podcast, in which we somewhat implied that public schools were in some way easier than independent schools because they weren't as much academically stressful and so forth. And Mark, you could share the name of the person if she feels comfortable. But
yeah, I don't want to share names without getting permission. But we got a really, really, really nice letter from someone who loves the podcast.
Yeah,
but said, I got a little of a bone to pick with you. I felt like you stereotyped public schools.
Yeah.
In that conversation. And the listener went on to say, I'm in the Silicon Valley, and these public schools are as stressful as anywhere. And you made it sound like you could, it's not going to be a stressful experience in the public school. So, yes. Dave wanted to take this opportunity to address that.
And I want to say she was right. And we overstated that. And we know that there are many, many very competitive public schools that have, in many ways, as much academic stress and rigor as the independent schools. We can look at areas of Silicon Valley, any rich suburb of any given city. There's always the high-profile public schools, and many times they're tougher because they have higher numbers and don't have the benefits of all these resources. So I do want to use this opportunity to correct that overstatement that we made last week. It was a very good point that was brought up by the listener.
Yeah, and we encourage you, by the way, send in feedback. It doesn't always have to be flowery and effusive. Like, if you feel we've slightly missed a mark on something, send it in. I've had an ongoing correspondence with a regular listener who has pointed out the fact they feel I'm a little too hard on College Confidential and Reddit. And they've had some good points. They said if you really know how to use it, there can be some really good message boards there that if you're responsible in your usage, there's value there. And I would agree with that as well. And so we appreciate that feedback when we get it.
So my thought is, totally realistically, the rich and powerful have always had advantages in this society and will always continue to have advantage. The reality is that our children, Mark, are never going to have the same easy path or the same open doors as the Zuckerbergs or the Bezoses or the person who can afford to write a check for $10 million and get their kid into any school in the world. But that being said, I think the purpose of the podcast is to mitigate those advantages and to bring with knowledge and with preparation to even out the playing field where possible. So that's point number one. And point number two, recognizing that for many schools, it is true. 20%, 25% of these kids get into Ivy League schools, but it also means that 60, 70% of kids do not. And many of those 60 and 70% of the kids are kids who in any other setting would have been total superstars. But now in this incredibly distilled environment of stress and excellence, they have a hard time standing out. And many of those kids, quite frankly, despite what we're saying about competitive public schools, might have been much better elsewhere. Because, if you're going in to Phillips Exeter, no matter how smart you are, you're still competing against that faculty kid.
Well, also, let me bring a point up, Dave, related to what you're saying. So what the article doesn't bring out, and I know this from experience, I've had multiple middle school valedictorians not get in some of these schools.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the percentage of the population, are they taking into consideration that some of these schools are literally turning down valedictorians? That's how talent rich their environment is. So there's just some statistics. What should our takeaways be on this article for the listener? From the article, not necessarily our podcast, but from the article.
Well, I think they have a point. I think that it is unfair that independent schools should dominate to the way they do. And I think it's unfair that so much of this domination is linked to wealth and privilege. That's the reality of the life that we live. But that being said, I don't think it's quite as bad as the numbers suggest. And there are ways to mitigate those. And that's what Your College Bound Kid is all about.
Yeah. And I think, one of my points would be careful with statistics.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of stats in here that are skewed. Another point of the article would be, rather than just get frustrated and think, wow, the deck is completely stacked against me, look at, what's happening from certain schools. One, broaden your college list and don't buy into the false, canard that there's only 20 good colleges out there. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Right.
Okay. That's the first thing that I would say. But secondly, do what you're doing. Educate yourself as to what it is that these schools are looking for. And you'll do really well in the process if you apply to the right schools. You really will. And most importantly, there's a lot of hullabaloo about where people go to school, but that is not necessarily correlated to life outcomes. And it's when people buy into that they get discouraged. You really have a lot more control over your destiny than you think you do. And if you buy into the notion that if you don't go to brand name U, you're kind of relegated to B status as far as career success, you're buying into something that just quite honestly just is not true.
Yep.
Let me say this too, Dave. I always welcome an opportunity to challenge the system to improve and to challenge school to do better. And so I do appreciate this article looking at in which ways are we catering to the wealthy and that we can maybe be a little bit more egalitarian. And even that, I think it overstated some things to make a point. If it challenges schools to look at themselves and look at their own bias in any way, shape, or form, then it can serve a positive purpose. So I want to just make sure I strike that balance as well.
Sounds good.
Some people think you're going to have this perfect society where there's no country clubs or everything's going to be utopic, and it's just not going to be that way.
And I was going to ask you this question. You take Phillips Exeter. what percentage of the parents went to Ivy League schools?
Well, it's going to be much higher than in your regular population, right? So it creates the alumni.
Yeah, it's probably going to be around mirroring the percentage of kids that get in.
Correct.
Like
so you have the
30%.
alumni. You have it there in the alumni. You have it in the alumni.
Right. So you actually have triple threat there. You have alumni, faculty, and wealth sometimes wrapped into one kid, right? So you have
not only that, you often have an athletic or artistic hook.
Right.
Because not only because of affluent parents build and cultivate and develop that, but because these schools recruit that in their admission process. So they find out, oh, you're incredible at crew. Okay, that's going to be a plus factor in your admissions, application. I mean, look, these schools know that part of how they market themselves is by that college list. So they know how to look for kids that the colleges already will want and take them on the front end.
Okay, so one thing to add in the podcast is many times you have kids applying for these schools who have multiple built-in hooks. They may be an alumni kid. They may have a father who is wealthy and may contribute. They may also be a faculty kid, and on top of that, they have great scores. And on top of that, they've probably got some type of leadership in arts or athletics. So and they might even be in a minority.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's in a niche sport. Like they learn early in the game, okay, it's easier to get into these colleges with these sports. So those are the sports we'll start playing at a young age. And then with their wealth, they get private coaching, all the right camps, all the right clinics. And then knowing that I can place this kid at Princeton, they're amazing at crew, boarding school, or the independent day school, they prioritize them and who gets through their front door.
Right.
So they already know before the kid walks in, this is a kid that can send to the Ivy League. Look how well they play squash.
You know what? I almost think of it like the genetically engineered Jean-Claude Van Damme super soldier. It's like you figured out the genetic profile.
Science fiction.
Yeah, I know. You should include this. They've got it down packed. It's like they got the Jean-Claude Van Damme model of how to get into Harvard, and they start working on you from middle school so that they create this perfect student monster all ready to take over the universe.
The masters of the universe.
That's right. The evil empire.